It was just another routine flight from Los Angeles to New York. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, the soft rattle of seatbelts, and the occasional murmur of flight attendants drifting through the air. But for one man, this particular journey would change the course of his life forever. Greg Matthews had always considered himself a man of distinction, middle-aged, well-groomed, wearing a tailored suit. He could walk into any room and command attention. He'd worked hard to climb his way up the corporate ladder. And now he relished the rewards. Luxury cars, expensive watches, and most importantly, the comfort of first class. That morning, Greg had boarded the plane early, eager to settle into the plush seat he had grown accustomed to. The flight attendant had already welcomed him aboard with a smile, offering him a glass of champagne. He took it with a nod, settling in as the other passengers trickled in. As the final few passengers boarded, Greg was flipping through his phone, checking his stock portfolio. That's when he saw him, a man entering first class, walking down the aisle with a confident stride, a slight smile on his face, and a presence that seemed to fill the entire cabin. Tom Cruise. Greg's eyes narrowed. Of course, he knew who Tom Cruise was. The actor, the megastar, the face of countless blockbusters. He had seen every movie the man had ever starred in. But to Greg, Tom Cruise wasn't just a movie star. He was a relic of the past, a faded icon from an earlier era. Tom was a man of yesterday, not someone whose name should still command such reverence in today's world of TikTok influencers and viral celebrities. Greg felt a small rush of irritation. He'd worked hard to earn the privileges he enjoyed now. And yet there was Tom Cruise, walking down the aisle like he owned the place. As if on cue, the man sat down in the seat across the aisle from Greg, close enough to make the already snobbish businessman feel even more uncomfortable. Greg was a man who didn't tolerate what he perceived as the arrogance of the rich and famous. It wasn't just that Tom Cruise had fame. It was the air of self-importance that Greg could sense in the way he walked, the way he smiled, the way he existed in the world. Who did he think he was? The flight attendants began making their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Greg took a deep breath, leaned back in his chair, and without a second thought, decided he couldn't let Tom Cruise sit there smugly, as if nothing had changed in the world since the 1980s. As Tom glanced over to him, Greg couldn't resist. "You know," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "you used to be a huge deal back in the day. What's it like to fade into obscurity?" Tom raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the boldness of the comment. Greg continued, with a smirk, "Don't get me wrong. Top Gun was a classic. But that was a lifetime ago. You're still riding that wave, aren't you? The aging action star living off his glory days. Must be tough." The words hung in the air like a challenge. A silence fell between them, broken only by the low hum of the plane and the faint clinking of glassware from the front cabin. Greg's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He had delivered his jab, and he was certain that Tom would cower, retreat, or at least offer some feeble defense. After all, this was Greg's world now. He was the one who called the shots, not the washed-up actor sitting in front of him. But Tom Cruise didn't flinch. Instead, he just smiled. The kind of smile that seemed to come from a place of quiet confidence, not arrogance. And then without a word, Tom stood up. Greg's smirk faltered as Tom walked toward the front of the plane, his presence unmistakable, drawing the eyes of everyone around. He had said his piece, but little did Greg know, the next moment would be the start of a journey he couldn't possibly have anticipated. Greg Matthews leaned back in his seat, feeling the familiar satisfaction of getting the upper hand. He wasn't one to back down in a confrontation, and his jab at Tom Cruise had been precise, cutting through the air with the weight of his superiority. He watched as the flight attendants continued to make their rounds, oblivious to the tension he'd just created. This was his world, a world where people like Tom Cruise, no matter how famous or iconic they were, had no place anymore. The era of movie stars was long past, replaced by influencers, tech moguls, and YouTube sensations. It was the new age, Greg's age. The more he thought about it, the more he felt justified in his words. "Why should I treat him like some untouchable legend?" Greg mused, adjusting his cufflinks. "He's just a guy living off old fame and fortune, just like everyone else. Nothing special about that anymore." The idea of Tom as an immortal legend started to feel ridiculous to Greg, almost laughable. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a movie of Tom's. Even Mission Impossible was a distant memory. Tom Cruise had no power here. Not in Greg's world. But even as Greg reveled in his self-assuredness, something in the air felt off. There was a strange energy surrounding the man. His silence as he walked away. It wasn't defensive or awkward. It was calm, measured. The kind of confidence that didn't need to prove anything. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What's going on with me? He thought, momentarily shaken. He didn't like the subtle twinge of unease creeping up his spine. No one makes me feel small. No one. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Tom had gone. The actor was talking to the flight attendants, laughing with them, clearly at ease. The passengers around him seemed to recognize him, and Greg could hear the occasional whisper of recognition. His grip tightened on the armrest. Greg had always been a man who thrived in the power of his own perception. He'd built his empire from nothing, but he'd done it through sharp wit and relentless ambition. Greg had mastered every room he entered, reading people like open books, figuring out their weaknesses before they even spoke. But there was something about Tom Cruise, something intangible, that made him feel as if his finely crafted world wasn't as stable as he thought. The way Tom carried himself, so effortlessly, so naturally, it made Greg question everything he had come to believe about himself, about who was truly in control. The flight continued, and the small talk from passengers around him faded into the background. But Greg's mind wouldn't settle. Every time he tried to think about something else, his business meetings in New York, his stock portfolio, the latest socialite parties he'd been invited to, his mind drifted back to Tom Cruise. It wasn't just the guy sitting across from him in first class. It was the image of a man who had weathered decades of success, of fame, of ups and downs, yet remained undeniably present. What if, Greg wondered, Tom's silence wasn't just humility? What if it was something else entirely? What if he was playing a game, one that Greg couldn't see? And worse, what if he was losing? He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the nagging thoughts. I'm not intimidated. I don't get intimidated by anyone. But deep down, Greg knew something had shifted. The words he had thrown at Tom earlier, casual and dismissive as they seemed at the time, were beginning to feel reckless. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't really know Tom. He didn't know what had brought him to this point. Didn't know what battles he had fought behind the scenes. What kind of person he was off-screen. All he saw was a man who, in Greg's mind, had overstayed his welcome in a world that had long moved on. Greg had no idea that the man he had insulted was far more than just an actor. Far more than just a public figure. What he didn't know was that in a few short hours, his world would be turned upside down. As the flight continued, the hours passed in a blur of soft turbulence and in-flight service. Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just Tom's presence. It was the odd way the entire cabin seemed to orbit around him. Every movement Tom made, from a casual laugh with the flight attendants to his friendly exchange with a fellow passenger, caught the attention of everyone around him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Greg could sense it. There was an energy around the man that couldn't be ignored. Greg, on the other hand, was accustomed to being the center of attention. In boardrooms, gala events, and luxury spaces like this, he was the one people looked to for approval. It had been his way for years. Yet in this moment he couldn't help but feel as though the room's focus was drifting elsewhere, towards Tom, whose quiet, confident demeanor seemed to command more respect than any overt display of wealth or power could. Greg felt an uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He reached for his drink and took a long sip, trying to push aside the irritation building within him. I'm imagining things, he thought, staring out the window. But the longer he thought about it, the more he realized how much he hated this feeling of being overshadowed. Eventually, the flight attendants came around for another round of drink service. As they passed by Greg, he caught sight of Tom, still across the aisle, laughing with a young woman seated next to him. They were sharing an inside joke, and the woman was hanging on every word Tom said. His calm, magnetic presence seemed to pull people in, drawing their attention without effort. Greg gritted his teeth. Who does this guy think he is? He had been dismissive of Tom's old fame earlier, but now it was different. It was no longer just a jab. There was a growing sense of discomfort, as if the world he had so carefully constructed was crumbling around him. What bothered him even more was that Tom didn't seem to be trying to prove anything at all. He wasn't showing off, wasn't boasting about past accomplishments. He was simply existing, and that seemed to be enough. "Everything all right over here, sir?" one of the flight attendants asked, her voice sweet but professional. She smiled at Greg, who was lost in thought. "Yeah, fine," he muttered, trying to shake off the sudden surge of unease. He took another sip of his drink and glanced over at Tom again. Only this time, Tom was looking right at him. Their eyes met briefly, and Greg felt a wave of tension shoot through him. "Is something wrong?" Tom asked, his voice calm and measured. There was no anger, no condescension, just a curiosity, as if he was genuinely wondering what was bothering Greg. It was a simple question, but for some reason, it made Greg's chest tighten. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but then hesitated. For a moment, he couldn't think of anything to say. The anger he had felt earlier bubbled up again, but it was tinged with something else, something unexpected, something deeper. The last thing he wanted to do was back down now. "I don't know," Greg said, forcing a laugh, though it felt hollow. "Just thinking about how things change, you know? Back in the day, you were on top. But nowadays it's different. People don't really care about big movie stars like they used to. They care about new things, new people." Tom didn't respond immediately. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for Greg to continue. Greg felt his face flush slightly. He hadn't meant to come across so bitterly, but it was too late. The words had already spilled out, and now there was no going back. For a long moment, Tom just stared at him, and the silence between them was almost suffocating. Greg waited for Tom to say something, maybe to defend himself or to challenge him. But Tom didn't. Instead, he simply nodded. "You're right," Tom said, his voice calm, not defensive. "Things change. People change." Greg blinked, taken aback by the quiet acceptance in Tom's voice. For a brief moment, he almost expected a punchline, some kind of joke to follow. But there was no humor in Tom's words, just an almost eerie calm. It felt like Greg's attempt at a confrontation had been completely defused. Not because Tom wasn't capable of defending himself, but because he didn't need to. He had all the time in the world to let Greg's insults bounce off him. That was when it hit Greg. Tom wasn't bothered by him at all. The thought was almost impossible to wrap his mind around. Here he was in a high-stakes situation, surrounded by wealth and status. And yet Tom Cruise wasn't concerned with him. He was just living, existing without the need for validation. It was something Greg wasn't used to, and it dug under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. As the flight continued, Greg's mind churned, but Tom remained calm. The movie star had nothing to prove. He wasn't angry, he wasn't showing off. He was comfortable, and that, more than anything, seemed to be the ultimate power move. Then came the announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be starting our descent into New York City in approximately 30 minutes. Please make sure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their full upright position, and that your seatbelt is securely fastened." The change in altitude shifted the mood in the cabin. The flight attendants began preparing for landing, and passengers began to stir. Greg, though, couldn't focus on the mundane preparations. He was too caught up in the realization that something had shifted within him. His words to Tom had been an attempt to assert dominance, to reclaim some sense of control. But in the process, he had only exposed his own vulnerabilities. His insecurity had gotten the best of him. And then, just as Greg's nerves began to settle into a cold discomfort, a voice from behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me," the voice said, low but commanding. Greg turned around, already feeling the faintest pulse of anxiety creeping up his spine. It was a man, probably in his late 30s, wearing a sleek, dark suit and holding a briefcase. There was something about the way he stood that commanded attention, the kind of presence that made Greg immediately recognize that he wasn't just any random passenger. He had power. And from the look in his eyes, it wasn't power Greg could control. "I couldn't help but overhear," the man continued. "But I think there's something you should know about your friend across the aisle." Greg narrowed his eyes, irritation flaring. "What's this about?" The man leaned in, his voice almost a whisper now. "You don't realize who you're talking to, do you?" Greg's heart skipped a beat. Greg stared at the man who had spoken to him. The stranger's tone was quiet, but laced with a kind of authority that Greg wasn't used to encountering in casual settings. His sharp suit, neatly pressed and impeccably tailored, seemed to signal that this wasn't someone who could be ignored. But it wasn't just his appearance that made Greg uneasy. It was the deliberate, almost cautious way he looked at him. The stranger held Greg's gaze for a moment, as if waiting for a response. But Greg, still feeling the weight of his earlier confrontation with Tom Cruise, couldn't find the words. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind raced to make sense of the situation. What the hell is going on? He had to admit that he was unnerved, both by his earlier actions and now by this mysterious man, who seemed to know something Greg didn't. "I'm sorry," Greg managed to say, forcing a tight smile. "I don't think I understand." The stranger didn't flinch, his eyes never leaving Greg's. "You will," he said cryptically, before glancing towards Tom, who had just returned to his seat after speaking with a flight attendant. The man's gaze lingered on the actor for a moment, as if studying him. Greg turned to follow the stranger's line of sight. Tom was seated calmly, sipping from a glass of water, completely at ease as if the chaos of Greg's earlier insult had never occurred. It irritated Greg to no end. How could Tom be so unaffected? This was his space, his world, and yet Tom Cruise, the aging actor, had completely upended it. The man beside him seemed to sense Greg's unease, and with a soft, almost amused smile, he leaned in a little closer. "I think you may want to rethink how you're handling this." His voice dropped to a near whisper, but Greg could feel the weight behind each word. "You've made an enemy of someone who's not just a movie star. You're about to learn exactly why." Greg's breath caught. His mind was spinning now, the words from the man echoing in his thoughts. What the hell does that mean? Before Greg could respond, the man stood up and slipped past him, disappearing into the first-class cabin with a purposeful stride. The whole interaction left him rattled. What the hell did he mean? Greg's chest tightened as he tried to push away the growing sense of dread. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. As the plane began its descent into New York, the tension in the air seemed to mount. The low hum of the engines turned into a faint roar, and the cabin lights dimmed. Greg looked at Tom again, and this time, the actor was no longer just sipping his water. His posture had shifted, his shoulders relaxed, but there was something else. A subtle shift in energy. He looked out the window, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Then something remarkable happened. The flight attendants began preparing for landing, but instead of staying in his seat like everyone else, Tom stood up. He moved smoothly down the aisle, his presence once again commanding attention. This time, it wasn't just the casual air of confidence that surrounded him. It was as if people were drawn to him, even if they didn't know why. There was a quiet but undeniable power in his every step. Greg watched him, every movement feeling like a deliberate challenge to his carefully curated sense of control. What is it with this guy? As Tom neared the front of the cabin, a man sitting near the cockpit stood up to greet him. They exchanged a few words in hushed tones, the man's posture stiff, almost reverential. Greg's jaw clenched. He had no idea what was going on, but it was beginning to feel like a game he hadn't even known he was playing, and it wasn't one he could win. It was then that the strange man reappeared, this time standing in the aisle near the back of the plane, watching Tom closely. Greg didn't know why, but the sight of the two men, Tom, calm and unshaken, and the mysterious figure, his demeanor increasingly tense, was like a fuse being lit inside him. His thoughts began to race, his mind looping back to the unsettling words the man had spoken earlier. He couldn't shake the sense that something important, something crucial, was slipping just beyond his reach. The flight attendants had finished their duties and were preparing for the final landing procedures. Greg looked down at his hands, gripping the armrest too tightly, feeling the cold sweat gathering at the back of his neck. But his mind was still reeling. He couldn't let go of the idea that Tom was somehow more than what he had assumed. Was he really just a washed-up actor, living in the past? Or was there more to him than the world and Greg had ever realized? Suddenly, the plane jolted slightly, throwing everyone forward into their seatbelts. The flight attendants moved quickly to ensure everything was secure, and there was a collective shift in the atmosphere as passengers braced for landing. But to Greg, everything felt as though it were in slow motion. His thoughts were racing, and the uncertainty gnawing at him refused to subside. He glanced once more at Tom. The actor was looking back at him now, his gaze calm, unwavering, but there was a quiet challenge in the way he held Greg's stare. It was subtle but unmistakable, as if Tom were daring him to keep questioning, to keep pushing. Then, without warning, the voice of the captain echoed through the intercom, offering final landing instructions, his voice steady, but carrying a tone of authority that seemed to sharpen the air inside the cabin. As the plane descended, Greg realized he wasn't just dealing with a celebrity. He was dealing with someone who commanded attention without lifting a finger. Someone who could throw Greg off balance without breaking a sweat. And Greg's earlier arrogance had only made him more determined to prove he wasn't intimidated. But what if he was? What if everything he had built for himself, the wealth, the status, the reputation, was nothing compared to whatever lay behind Tom's seemingly effortless confidence? In the final moments before landing, Greg's mind was racing faster than the plane. His world, which had once seemed solid and unshakable, was beginning to crack. And as the plane touched down on the runway with a soft bump, Greg knew this was just the beginning. The challenges ahead would not be fought with words or insults. They would be fought with something deeper, something Greg had never prepared for. As the plane taxied down the runway, and the familiar rumble of the wheels echoed beneath them, Greg felt an odd sense of dread settle deep in his gut. He had been watching Tom from the corner of his eye the entire flight, and as much as he tried to brush it off, there was an undeniable feeling creeping in. Something was about to change. It was as if everything he had known was shifting beneath his feet, and no matter how hard he tried to regain control, it slipped further away. Tom, calm as ever, was still seated when the plane came to a full stop. Most of the passengers began to stir, gathering their things and preparing to disembark. But Greg couldn't focus on the usual post-flight chaos. His thoughts were consumed by what the strange man had whispered to him earlier. "You don't realize who you're talking to, do you?" Those words haunted him, gnawing at his pride and ego. Who was Tom really? He wasn't just an actor anymore. The more Greg thought about it, the more he began to doubt everything he knew about the world around him. In his mind, Tom was just another fading celebrity, a relic of a bygone era. But the interactions he had witnessed throughout the flight, Tom's unshakable composure, the reverence with which others treated him, challenged everything Greg thought he understood. As passengers started to gather their bags and file out of the plane, Greg noticed that the man in the dark suit had returned. He was standing near the front of the cabin again, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had someone with him, another man, dressed in a black coat and dark sunglasses, who appeared to be scanning the cabin with a sharp, focused gaze. The two men exchanged a few words, and then the suited man turned to Greg, his eyes now heavy with meaning. Greg's pulse quickened. This couldn't be good. The unease that had been building throughout the flight intensified, and Greg's thoughts spiraled. What the hell is going on? What do these people know that I don't? Mr. Greg Holloway, the suited man finally spoke, his voice smooth but forceful. We need to have a word. Greg froze. The man's tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. He was being summoned, as if he were part of something bigger, something far beyond his understanding. He shot a quick glance at Tom, but the actor remained seated, staring out of the window with the same calm expression he had worn all flight. "Mr. Holloway, please. It's important." The man's voice now carried a hint of urgency. Without a word, Greg stood up, his heart pounding as he made his way toward the front of the cabin. The strange man led him into the galley area, a small private space near the cockpit. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and for the first time all day, Greg felt truly trapped. The suited man was already speaking before Greg could even process what was happening. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Because you're not just insulting a washed-up actor. Tom Cruise is someone who has made his mark on the world in ways you can't even begin to comprehend." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but the man held up a hand, silencing him. "Do you think all the power in the world comes from money?" the suited man asked, his voice low and controlled. From influence in the business world? From the names on your private jets and your investments in high-end companies? If so, you're blind. Greg's jaw tightened. This was the last thing he needed, a lecture on power and influence. He opened his mouth again, but the man spoke first. Tom Cruise is someone who doesn't need the world to recognize his value, the man continued. He's not just a movie star. He's been involved in some of the most covert, world-altering decisions of the past decades. He's protected people, influenced policy, and made decisions that you could never even fathom. What you're witnessing today isn't just some old actor trying to relive his glory days. This is a man who controls things on a global scale. Greg felt the floor beneath him shift. His mind scrambled to process the words coming from the stranger. Tom Cruise, had been at the center of world-altering decisions? It was too much to absorb all at once. He wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss the man as another lunatic making outrageous claims. But the sincerity in the stranger's eyes gave him pause. Why do you think he's so unbothered by your insults? The man's voice dropped even lower, his words laced with venom now. Because he doesn't care about the petty drama of your life. He's moved beyond that. But you, Greg, the man's gaze hardened. You've just begun a path that could be your undoing. Greg's pulse throbbed in his ears. His thoughts collided, rage mixing with disbelief. What was this? Was this a joke? But before Greg could speak, the suited man turned and nodded toward the door. You'll see soon enough. In that moment, everything clicked for Greg. The man wasn't just threatening him. He was trying to prepare him. Whatever Tom had been involved in, whatever his true power was, it wasn't something that could be ignored. Greg had just crossed a line, and it felt as though there was no turning back. The door opened, and the man motioned for Greg to follow him back to the cabin. As they re-entered the aisle, Greg's gaze landed on Tom once more. But this time, the actor wasn't looking out the window. His eyes met Greg's with an unsettling calm. Greg couldn't look away. It was then that he understood. The game had never been about wealth or status. Tom was playing a different game altogether. One that Greg hadn't even realized he was part of until now. Suddenly, the entire cabin felt smaller. The air seemed thicker. As Greg walked back to his seat, his chest tight and his thoughts spinning, the realization hit him hard. The man he had tried to dismiss earlier, the one he'd mocked, was far more powerful than Greg had ever imagined. And the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. As the plane's wheels touched the ground, Greg knew the truth. The real journey was only beginning. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the flight attendants began preparing for deplaning. But Greg couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. The pressure inside the cabin had risen, and he felt it like a weight on his chest. He glanced around nervously, but his focus was still fixed on Tom, whose calm demeanor had now taken on an almost unsettling quality. There was something about the way the actor was holding himself, as though he knew something Greg didn't, and it was beginning to feel like the walls were closing in. Greg's hands trembled slightly as he grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment. His mind was spinning, every thought tangled in confusion and disbelief. How had he gotten here? From mocking Tom in the first-class cabin to being blindsided by the reality of the man's true power. It was like waking up from a nightmare and realizing it was all real. The arrogant words he had thrown at Tom now seemed childish, insignificant, and far too bold. In the midst of his thoughts, the suited man approached him once again. This time, there was no cryptic message or veiled threat. The man spoke in a low, serious tone that left no room for doubt. You need to understand something. Tom Cruise is a name you know because of movies. But he's been part of much bigger, far more impactful things than you can imagine. His role has never been just about fame. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but the man held up his hand again. You've already crossed a line. Now you're going to face the consequences of your arrogance. Greg felt his stomach drop. Consequences? The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. All his pride, his assumptions, everything he thought he knew was crumbling in the face of the truth. He had insulted someone who wasn't just a celebrity, but a player in a game far larger than he could ever comprehend. The suited man stepped aside, and Greg saw Tom standing now, effortlessly blending in with the other passengers. But there was something different about him now. A quiet, almost regal air that had been missing before. His gaze, which had once felt distant, now seemed focused on Greg, piercing through him, as though he could read every thought in his head. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Greg felt a wave of shame rush over him. He wasn't just a fool. He was a man who had underestimated someone who was far beyond his league. Tom took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. "You've said your piece, Greg," he said, his tone carrying a quiet weight. "Now, you'll learn what happens when you forget that not everyone plays by the same rules." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Greg could only stand there, his mind still reeling. He wanted to apologize, to take back everything he had said. But something about Tom's demeanor told him that wasn't what was needed. Tom wasn't interested in words, he was interested in actions. The suited man was still watching Greg intently, and for the first time, the realization hit Greg with brutal clarity. This wasn't about some petty flight incident. This was about something far more profound. Tom wasn't just a victim of Greg's arrogance. He was someone who had seen it all before, and yet still chose to act with dignity and humility. The man who Greg had mocked wasn't the arrogant one in the room. Greg was. As the plane's doors opened, and passengers began to file out, Greg knew his life was about to change. The man who had stood up to him was no longer the subject of ridicule. He was a force Greg couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, as the world outside the aircraft seemed to stretch endlessly before him, Greg had no idea what awaited him next. But one thing was certain. The lesson he had just learned would follow him for the rest of his life. As Greg walked off the plane, the world felt different. The buzz of the terminal, the hum of the air conditioning, the chatter of passengers, it all seemed so distant now, as though he were moving through life in a fog. He barely noticed the crowd parting as he made his way toward the baggage claim area, his mind still spinning with everything that had just happened. The events of the flight had shaken him to his core. But more than that, they had left him with a growing sense of humility, something he had never really felt before, not in this way. He had always prided himself on his sharp wit, his ability to control situations with his words. But now those words seemed empty, hollow. He had misjudged someone so profoundly, and for what? To stroke his own ego? To feel better about himself in front of strangers? The arrogance he had displayed towards Tom had felt like an accomplishment in the moment. But now, it was an embarrassing memory that he couldn't escape. As Greg waited for his luggage, he caught a glimpse of Tom out of the corner of his eye. The actor was standing a few feet away, speaking with someone, a business associate, perhaps, or another influential figure. Even in this public space, Tom carried himself with an unspoken authority that drew people to him. And yet, despite all the eyes on him, despite his fame, there was an undeniable aura of calm around him. The same calm that had taken Greg completely by surprise during the flight. Greg watched, his chest tightening. He wanted to approach Tom, apologize, explain that he had been wrong. But part of him was afraid of what might happen if he did. What if Tom rejected him? What if his words now seemed as meaningless as they had before? The suited man from the flight appeared again, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching Greg with the same inscrutable expression. His presence sent a shiver down Greg's spine. It was clear now that this man, Tom's associate, was a part of something far larger than Greg could understand. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. Greg turned back to the baggage claim, his eyes on the conveyor belt. But his mind was still focused on the encounter he had just lived through. What had he learned? What had this experience shown him? He thought about the arrogance he had displayed, how quickly he had dismissed Tom as just another celebrity. He had assumed that fame and wealth were all that mattered, that someone like Tom could be reduced to a few headlines and box office numbers. But now, in the wake of everything he had witnessed, the quiet strength in Tom's demeanor, the way he had handled the insults with grace, the influence he had on people without ever raising his voice, it was impossible to ignore the lesson that had been staring him in the face the entire time. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It was about humility. It was about character and integrity, the quiet power that comes from living with purpose, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Greg took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. The baggage claim belt finally moved, and Greg grabbed his suitcase. The journey to the exit felt longer than usual, as though each step carried more weight than the one before. He reached the glass doors of the terminal and stepped outside, squinting as the daylight hit his eyes. The world seemed brighter, somehow clearer. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't check it. His thoughts were too consumed by what had happened, by the shift in perspective that had occurred over the course of that flight. He knew he would never look at people, or at the world, the same way again. He wasn't the same person anymore. But it was the reflection that stuck with him. In the past, Greg had lived a life dictated by his own pride. Quick to dismiss, slow to listen, and even slower to learn. But now he understood. There was a different way to live. A way that didn't involve tearing others down to lift oneself up. Tom had shown him that, whether he intended to or not. And for the first time in Greg's life, he felt a real sense of gratitude. He was a better person for it. He glanced once more at the terminal behind him, but Tom was no longer in sight. He was probably long gone, off to another event or another city, to continue whatever mysterious work he had. But for Greg, the lessons of that brief encounter would remain with him for a long time to come. His arrogance had been exposed, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing how many opportunities he had missed in life, by being blinded by his own ego. As Greg drove away from the airport, the city sprawling out before him, he couldn't help but think of what Tom had said on the plane. You'll learn what happens when you forget that not everyone plays by the same rules. In that moment, Greg understood exactly what that meant. There was power in humility, in quiet strength. There was a kind of influence that came from living a life of purpose, without ever needing to shout about it from the rooftops. And for the first time in a long time, Greg felt like he was ready to play by those rules. Weeks passed after the flight, but Greg couldn't stop thinking about the experience. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone different staring back at him. The cocky, self-assured man, who once believed he could get away with anything, was now replaced by someone who recognized the value of humility. He began to change his interactions with others. At work, Greg noticed the subtle shift in how he treated people. No longer dismissing those with less power or status, but listening to their ideas and respecting their perspectives. His colleagues began to comment on how much more approachable and thoughtful he had become. Even his friends noticed the difference, remarking how his conversations had shifted from self-centered anecdotes to more genuine, meaningful discussions. Greg was learning that influence didn't come from belittling others, or proving how much you knew. It came from how you made people feel. And more often than not, people remembered kindness and wisdom far longer than they remembered sharp words or prideful actions. One afternoon, months after that fateful flight, Greg was sitting in a coffee shop when his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I heard about your recent changes, Greg. I think you're on the right path. Keep going. The message was unsigned, but Greg recognized the tone immediately. It was from Tom. He felt a strange, warm sense of gratitude flood over him. Tom didn't need to send him a message. He didn't need to reach out. But in doing so, he had reminded Greg that his transformation wasn't just a fleeting change. It was a permanent shift. Greg had been given a chance to reset his entire way of thinking, and he wasn't going to squander it. Greg smiled, taking a moment to reflect on everything he had learned. He knew the world around him hadn't changed. It was still full of arrogant people, easy shortcuts, and harsh words. But Greg now understood that he didn't have to play by those rules anymore. There was a power in stepping back, in choosing kindness, in letting others reveal their true selves without feeling the need to put them down first. The next day, Greg made a decision. He reached out to Tom, not to ask for anything, but to thank him. He found Tom's assistant's number, sent a simple email, and expressed his gratitude for the lesson, for the humility Tom had unknowingly instilled in him. It wasn't about trying to get anything in return. It was about taking responsibility for his actions, about acknowledging that Tom had, in his own quiet way, given him a gift that he would cherish forever. The message was short, sincere, and honest. I just wanted to thank you. You changed the way I see the world, and I'll never forget that. He hit send, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. The world felt quieter, somehow more meaningful. It wasn't about fame or status anymore. It wasn't about being noticed or recognized. It was about choosing the right path, the path that led to growth, humility, and genuine connection with others. As Greg sat back and looked out the window of the coffee shop, he realized that the greatest lesson Tom had taught him wasn't through words or actions. It was through being the kind of person who made others want to be better. In a world full of noise, that kind of quiet strength was something everyone could aspire to. And Greg was on his way to becoming that person,